Hi, ninth and 10th. This is that continuation of fairy tales that I promised you earlier. We're going to be doing two more stories of Cinderella. Don't worry, we're not going to be doing just Cinderella. I know these are very girly stories for some of you. That's okay. You can actually learn quite a lot from the culture that they were written in at the time, what was really important for women, what was really important to see in men. So pay really close attention and let's go through these two stories, both of which are from Europe. The first one is from Germany, and it was collected as a part of a series of folk tales that were being collected by the brothers Grimm. So this is the Grimm version of Cinderella. The wife of a rich man fell sick, and as she felt that her end was drawing near, she called her only daughter to her bedside and said, "Dear child, be good and pious, and then the good God will always protect you, and I will look down on you from heaven and be near you." Thereupon she closed her eyes and departed. Every day the maiden went out to her mother's grave and wept, and she remained pious and good. Pious means godly. When winter came, the snow spread a white sheet over the grave, and by the time the spring sun had drawn it off again, the man had taken another wife. So we have this poetic passage of time. The woman had brought with her into the house two daughters who were beautiful and fair of face, but vile and black of heart. This is one of those things that you're learning in this particular version of the fairy tale, that the two stepsisters weren't ugly at all. They were quite beautiful, just as Cinderella is going to be pictured as beautiful, but the inside of them is very, very ugly. Now began a bad time for the poor stepchild. "Is the stupid goose to sit in the parlor with us?" they said. He who wants to eat his bread must earn it." They're getting that from the Bible, but they're misapplying it. Out with the kitchen wench." They took her pretty clothes away from her, put an old gray bedgown on her, and gave her wooden shoes. The wooden shoes were what the peasantry wore. It was great for keeping you above the surface of mud in the streets or in the garden. They were pretty much waterproof and weatherproof, and they were easy to replace. "Just look at the proud princess, how decked out she is," they cried, and laughed, and led her to the kitchen. There she had to do hard work from morning till night, get up before daybreak, carry waters, light fires, cook, and wash. Besides this, the sisters did every unimaginable injury. They mocked her and emptied her peas and lentils into the ashes, so that she was forced to sit and pick them out again. Because things had to be stored for long periods of time, the lentils and the peas, they could be dried and then stored in jars or canisters, but before they were cooked, it was the job of the cook or whoever else was preparing the food to pick through all of those peas or lentils. A lentil is any kind, it's like a bean that opens on two sides directly in half. That's a lentil. So peanuts or lentils, you get the picture there. Okay, so it's up to the cook to pick through and make sure that all of the peas are actually really good. You don't want anything that's got mold on it or something that's got some dirt ingrained in like a crack. You don't want anything that hasn't dried properly. It's just, it rotted instead. So that would be her job, is to go through the lentils and the peas and make sure that they were in good condition. But her sisters, to bully her, would take her peas and lentils and throw them into the ashes, and she'd have to start all over again. So this became her daily chore. Let's see. In the evening, when she had worked till she was weary, she had no bed to go to, but had to sleep by the hearth in the cinders. And as on that account she always looked dusty and dirty, they called her Cinderella. Cinder, because that's what the fire, is made up of, cinders. And then Ella would have been probably a play on her name. You notice the father is not involved in her life anymore. He is totally smitten with the wife and the new wife and the stepdaughters. He has no time for his previous wife's daughter. It happened that the father was once going to the fair, and he asked his two stepdaughters what he should bring back for them. "Beautiful dresses," said one. "Pearls and jewels," said the second. "And you, Cinderella, what will you have?" Okay, he is buying something for his daughter. He's offering to, but he's also calling her Cinderella. So, not a great guy. "Father, break off for me the first branch which knocks against your hat on the way home." We see this as a kind of an echo from a famous French fairy tale, Beauty and the Beast, when all Beauty wanted, from when her and her brothers and sisters were stuck out in the woods after their father lost their fortune, they asked all her sisters asked the dad to go buy them something, and all she asked for is a rose. That's all she wants, is a single rose. Okay, so something natural. So he bought beautiful dresses, pearls and jewels for his two stepdaughters, and on his way home, as he was riding through a green thicket, a hazel twig brushed against him and knocked off his hat. Then he broke off the branch and took it with him. When he reached home, he gave his stepdaughters the things they had wished for, and to Cinderella he gave the branch from the hazel bush. Cinderella thanked him, went to her mother's grave, and planted the branch on it. The hazel twig is very specifically mentioned because that was what was used as material for magic wands, according to pagan tradition. So she plants the branch on her mother's grave and wept so much that the tears fell down on it and watered it. And it grew. It became a handsome tree. Thrice a day Cinderella went and sat beneath it and wept and prayed. We have a repetition of things 3 times here. So she's praying 3 times a day. And a little white bird always came on the tree, and if Cinderella expressed a wish, the bird threw down to her what she had wished for. So we have the pagan symbolism with the twig, the hazel twig, which is a magic wand that grows into this magical tree almost overnight. And then we have the bird, which would be representative of almost Christian belief, because the Holy Spirit is often depicted as a bird, specifically a white dove. But it's even more than that. It's depicting the spirit of the mom's spirit in this little bird that is still taking care of the daughter. It happened, however, that the king gave orders for a festival which was to last 3 days, and to which all the beautiful young girls in the country were invited, in order that his son might choose himself a bride. When the 2 stepsisters heard this, they too were to appear among the number. They were delighted, called Cinderella and said, "Comb our hair for us, brush our shoes, fasten our buckles, for we are going to the wedding at the king's palace." Cinderella obeyed, but wept, because she too would have liked to go with them to the dance, and begged her stepmother to allow her to do so. "You go, Cinderella," said she, "covered in dust and dirt as you are, and would go to the festival? You have no clothes and shoes, and yet would dance?" As, however, Cinderella went on asking, the mother said, at last, "I've emptied a dish of lentils into the ashes for you. If you have picked them out again in 2 hours, you shall go with us." So this thing where this little girl gets bullied on the daily by her 2 stepsisters, by them throwing the cleaned peas and lentils into the ashes, the stepmom does the exact same thing as part of this test. You've got 2 hours and you can go with us. The maiden went through the back door into the garden and called, "You tame pigeons, you turtle doves, and all you birds beneath the sky, come and help me to pick. The good go into the pot, the bad into the crop." So she asked for help from animal friends. It's the first time we're going to see this, but it's going to be a motif in fairy tales. So the birds come in, they're going to put the good seed into the pot to be cooked, and the bad they get to eat. Then 2 white pigeons came in by the kitchen window. Now this is going to be a little change. We have the white dove that's in the tree that throws down these wishes. And now we have 2 white birds that are going to come into the kitchen window. And they're going to repeat. They're going to come about every once in a while through this story. They're going to become motifs. So then 2 white pigeons came in by the kitchen window, and afterwards the turtle doves, and at last all the birds beneath the sky came whirring and crowding in and alighted among the ashes, and the pigeons nodded with their heads and began pick, 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 and the rest also began pick, 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 and gathered all the good grains into the dish. Hardly had 1 hour passed before they had finished, and all flew out again. Then the girl took the dish to her stepmother and was glad and believed that now she would be allowed to go with them to the festival. But the stepmother said, "No, Cinderella, you have no clothes, and you cannot dance. You would only be laughed at." And as Cinderella wept at this, the stepmother said, "If you can pick 2 dishes of lentils out of the ashes for me in 1 hour, you shall go with us." And she thought to herself that she most certainly cannot do again. When the stepmother had emptied the 2 dishes of lentils amongst the ashes, the maiden went through the back door into the garden and cried, "You tame pigeons, you turtle doves, and all you birds beneath the sky, come and help me to pick. The good into the pot, the bad into the crop." Then 2 white pigeons came in by the kitchen window, and afterwards the turtle doves, and at length all the birds beneath the sky came whirring and crowding in, and alighted amongst the ashes. And the doves nodded with their heads, and began to pick, 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 and the others also began to pick, 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 and gathered all the good seeds into the dishes, and before half an hour was over, they had already finished, and all flew out again. Then the maiden was delighted to believe that she might now go with them to the ball. But the stepmother said, "All this will not help. You cannot go with us, for you have no clothes and cannot dance. We should be ashamed of you." On this, she turned her back to Cinderella and hurried away with her 2 proud daughters. Okay, there's a lot of repetition in this fairy tale because when you think about it, fairy tales were originally said out loud. We have done enough study on oral traditions and oral stories and the oral retelling of these stories to understand that repetition helped the speaker to remember exactly what was happening. Okay. As no one was now at home, Cinderella went to her mother's grave beneath the hazel tree and cried, "Shiver and quiver, little tree, silver and gold, throw down over me." Then the bird threw a gold and silver dress down to her and slippers embroidered with silk and silver. She put on the dress with all speed and went to the wedding. Her stepsisters and the stepmother, however, did not know her and thought she must be a foreign princess, for she looked so beautiful in the golden dress. They never once thought of Cinderella and believed she was sitting at home in the dirt picking lentils out of the ashes. The prince approached her, took her by the hand, and danced with her. He would dance with no other maiden and never let loose her hand. And if anyone else came to invite her, he said, "This is my partner." She danced till it was evening, and then she wanted to go home. But the king's son said, "I will go with you and bear you company," for he wished to see to whom the beautiful maiden belonged. She escaped from him, however, and sprang into the pigeon house. So he walks her all the way to the home, but then she gives him the slip and escapes into the pigeon house. But he barely sees her go in. The king's son waited until her father came, and then told him that the unknown maiden had leapt into the pigeon house. The old man thought, "Could it be Cinderella?" And they had to bring him an axe and a pickaxe that he might hew the pigeon house to pieces, but no one was inside it. And when they got home, Cinderella lay in her dirty clothes among the ashes, and a dim little oil lamp was burning on the mantelpiece, for Cinderella had jumped quickly down from the back of the pigeon house and had run to the little hazel tree, and there she had taken off the beautiful clothes and laid them on the grave, and the bird had taken them away again, and then she had seated herself in the kitchen amongst the ashes in her gray gown. The whole reason the prince wanted to walk her home was because he wanted to meet her people. He's interested in her. He has spent the evening with her, talking to her and getting to know who she is and realizing she's really, really beautiful, not just on the outside, but on the inside. Next day, when the festival began afresh, and her parents and the stepsisters had gone once more, Cinderella went back to the hazel tree and said, "Shiver and quiver, my little tree, silver and gold, throw down over me." Then the bird threw down a much more beautiful dress than on the preceding day, and when Cinderella appeared at the wedding in this dress, everyone was astonished at her beauty. The king's son had waited until she came, and instantly took her by the hand and danced with no one but her. When others came and invited her, he said, "This is my partner." When evening came, she wished to leave, and the king's son followed her and wanted to see into which house she went. But she sprang away from him and into the garden behind the house. Therein stood a beautiful tall tree on which hung the most magnificent pears. She clambered so nimbly between the branches like a squirrel that the king's son did not know where she was gone. He waited until her father came and said to him, "The unknown maiden has escaped from me, and I believe has climbed up the pear tree." The father thought, "Can it be Cinderella?" and had an axe brought and cut the tree down, but no one was on it. And when they got into the kitchen, Cinderella lay there among the ashes as usual, for she had jumped down on the other side of the tree, had taken the beautiful dress to the bird on the little hazel tree, and put on her gray gown. On the third day, when the parents and sisters had gone away, Cinderella went once more to her mother's grave and said to the little tree, "Shiver and quiver, my little tree, silver and gold throw down over me." And now the bird threw down to her a dress which was more splendid and magnificent than any she yet had, and the slippers were golden. And when she went to the festival in the dress, no one knew how to speak for astonishment. The king's son danced with her only, and if anyone invited her to dance, he said, "This is my partner." Okay, so you saw the difference in the sandal or in the shoe, correct? Okay, so the first story we read was from China, and the shoe was an embroidered shoe. Cinderella in this story also goes to the ball in an embroidered shoe for the first time and the second time, but now it is a gold shoe. And it's not golden, it's gold. It's not a glass slipper. That's going to come much later. The original tales from Grimm's brothers, they wrote this one down, but they said in some cases it was a fur slipper. Okay, but now we're talking gold. When evening came, Cinderella wished to leave 3 times. Good luck. Okay. And the king's son was anxious to go with her, but she escaped from him so quickly he could not follow her. The king's son, however, had employed a ruse. She's escaped 2 times before, and now he's going to find out for sure where she's going. He's going to slow her down. He caused the whole staircase to be smeared with pitch or tar, and there, when she ran down, had the maiden's left slipper remained stuck. The king's son picked it up, and it was small and dainty and all golden. Next morning, he went with it to the father. He's not going around the whole country looking for who belongs to the slipper. He knows she's from that house. He's going to figure it out. But he takes the slipper to the father and said to him, "No one shall be my wife, but she whose foot this golden slipper fits." Then were the 2 sisters glad, for they had pretty feet. The eldest went with the shoe into her room and wanted to try it on, and her mother stood by. It's very likely she went to the shoe or into another room because she was being more modest. She was wearing very complicated clothing, and she was going to be taking off a shoe, putting on a shoe. It's going to require a little bit of gymnastics here in these clothes, especially if you're wearing a corset and can't bend over. But she could not, she's putting on the shoe, but she could not get her big toe into it, and the shoe was too small for her. Then her mother gave her a knife and said, "Cut the toe off. When you are queen, you will have no more need to go on foot." The maiden cut the toe off, forced the foot into the shoe, swallowed the pain, and went out to the king's son. Then he took her on his horse as his bride and rode away with her. They were obliged, however, to pass the grave, and there on the hazel tree sat 2 pigeons, and they cried, turn and peep, there's blood within the shoe. The shoe is too small for her. The true bride waits for you." Then he looked at her foot and saw how the blood was trickling from it. He turned his horse around and took the false bride home again and said she was not the true one, and that the other sister was to put the shoe on. Then this one went into her chamber and got her toe safely into the shoe, but her heel was too large. So her mother gave her a knife and said, "Cut a bit off your heel. When you are queen, you will have no more need to go on foot." The maiden cut a bit off her heel, forced her foot into the shoe, swallowed her pain, and went out to the king's son. He took her on his horse as his bride and rode away with her, but when they passed by the hazel tree, the 2 pigeons sat on it and cried, turn and peep, there's blood within the shoe. The shoe is too small for her. The true bride waits for you." He looked down at her foot and saw how the blood was running out of her shoe and how it had stained her white stocking quite red. Then he turned his horse and took the false bride home again. "This also is not the right one," said he. "Have you no other daughter?" It's almost like he's returning something to the store, but yeah. But here's the really sad part. He knows that the girl he spent the evenings with was wearing this shoe. And so he's looking for her. Maybe he can't recognize her, but he recognizes that there's going to be an interior that he wants to get to know. But here's the awful part. The father is going to reject her. He's going to claim he doesn't even have another daughter. This is his own flesh and blood. This is from his first wife, this little daughter, and he's going to reject her and say, "Nope, I don't have any other daughters." Listen to how he describes her. "No," said the man, "there is still a little stunted kitchen wench which my late wife left behind her, but she cannot possibly be the bride." The king's son said he was to send her up to him. But the mother answered, "Oh no, she is much too dirty. She cannot show herself." But he absolutely insisted on it, and Cinderella had to be called. She first washed her hands and face clean, and then went and bowed herself before the king's son, who gave her the golden shoe. Then she seated herself on a stool, drew her foot out of the heavy wooden shoe, and put it into the slipper, which fitted like a glove. You notice she doesn't leave because she has nowhere to go. She's homeless in the house. She lives in the fireplace. Also, she's going to be wearing a lot less complicated clothing. When she rose, the king's son looked at her face and recognized the beautiful maiden who had danced with him and cried, "This is the true bride." The stepmother and 2 sisters were horrified and became pale with rage. He, however, took Cinderella on his horse and rode away with her. As they passed by the hazel tree, the 2 white doves cried, turn and peep, no blood is in the shoe. The shoe is not too small for her. The true bride rides with you." And when they had cried that, the two came flying down and placed themselves on Cinderella's shoulders, one on the right, the other on the left, and remaining sitting there. When the wedding of the king's son was to be celebrated, the two false sisters came and wanted to get into favor with Cinderella and share her good fortune. When the betrothed couple went to the church, the elder was at the right side and the younger at the left, and the pigeons pecked out one eye from each of them. Afterwards, as they came back, the elder was at the left, the younger at the right, and the pigeons pecked out the other eye from each. And thus, for their wickedness and falsehood, they were punished with blindness all their days. If no one else was going to punish these two stepsisters for the horrible way they treated Cinderella, nature was going to correct the problem. Okay, that's the grim version of the fairy tale. You may have noticed that there were some elements missing that you might recognize from the story of Cinderella. Maybe you'll find them in this story. This is actually the one I grew up on. Cinderella or the Little Glass Slipper by Charles Perrault. And this is the one that was really used a lot by Disney as an influence. Okay. Once there was a gentleman who married for the second time the proudest, most haughty woman that was ever seen. She had by a former husband 2 daughters of her own, who were, indeed, exactly like her in all things. He had likewise by another wife a young daughter, but of unparalleled goodness and sweetness of temper, which she took from her mother, who was the best creature in the world. No sooner were the ceremonies of the wedding over, but the stepmother began to show herself in her true colors. She could not bear the good qualities of this pretty girl, and the less because they made her daughters appear the more odious. She employed her in the meanest work of the house. She scoured the dishes, tables, etc., and cleaned the madam's chamber and those of the misses, her daughters. She slept in a sorry garret, that's an attic, with a wretched straw bed, while her sister slept in fine rooms with floors all inlaid, on beds of the very newest fashion, and where they had looking-glasses so large they could see themselves at their full length, from head to foot. Okay, I told you I grew up with this story, and I grew up with a book that was illustrated, and this is one of the illustrations in that book. I loved these illustrations growing up. I thought they were absolutely gorgeous, but I didn't understand this one until today. I was today years old when I figured out what this was. See, growing up, I just assumed that because this was part of the Cinderella story and it was across the page from the opening of Cinderella, that somehow Cinderella was in this picture, and I always thought it was the smallest person in this picture was Cinderella. Yeah, and I couldn't figure out why the illustrator would make her look so ugly. She's just got like 5 head, okay, and sausage curls on the side, and I just thought, that's kind of a weird thing. It wasn't till today when I put the picture next to these lines that I realized that this is a picture of the mirror. This is the stepmom and the 2 stepsisters looking at themselves in a looking glass so large they can see themselves from head to foot. Yep, I figured that out today. I had a moment. You never stop learning. Okay, going on. The poor girl bore it all patiently and dared not tell her father, who would have scolded her, for his wife governed him entirely. When she had done her work, she used to go to the chimney corner and sit down there in the cinders and ashes, which caused her to be called Cinder Wench, or Cinder Girl. Only the younger sister, who was not quite so rude and uncivil as the older one, called her Cinderella. However, Cinderella, notwithstanding her coarse apparel, was 100 times more beautiful than her sisters, although they were always dressed very richly. It happened that the king's son gave a ball and invited all persons of fashion to it. Our young misses were also invited, for they cut a very grand figure among those of quality. They were mightily delighted at this invitation, and wonderfully busy in selecting the gowns, petticoats, and hair-dressings that would best become them. This was a new difficulty for Cinderella, for she, who ironed her sisters' linen and pleated the ruffles, they talked all day long of nothing but how they should be dressed. For my part, said the eldest, I will wear my red velvet suit with the French trimming. And I, said the youngest, shall have my usual petticoat. But then, to make amends for that, I will put on my gold-flowered cloak and my diamond stomacher, which is far from being the most ordinary in the world. Then they sent for the best hairdresser they could get to make up their headpieces and adjust their hairdos, and they had their red brushes and patches from Mademoiselle de la Pouche. Okay, these are cosmetic items. Okay, growing up, I didn't really understand what a stomacher was. I just kind of skipped over that until I was old enough to actually look it up in the dictionary. The white part of this dress on the chest and going down to the stomach, that's a stomacher, and it actually just straps into the dress. It's a separate part. And so this one stepdaughter having a diamond stomacher, it's probably studded with little diamond chips. Okay. They also consulted Cinderella in all these matters, for she had excellent ideas, and her advice was always good. Indeed, she even offered her services to fix their hair, which they very willingly accepted. As she was doing this, they said to her, "Cinderella, would you not like to go to the ball?" "Alas," said she, "you only jeer at me, it is not for such as I am to go to such a place." "You're quite right," they replied. "It would make the people laugh to see a cinder wench at the ball." Anyone but Cinderella would have fixed their hair awry, but she was very good and dressed them perfectly well. They were so excited that they hadn't eaten a thing in almost 2 days. Then they broke more than a dozen laces trying to have themselves laced up tightly enough to give them a fine, slender shape. This is the idea that they're having their corset laces pulled tight so they can look thinner. They were continually in front of their looking glass. At last the happy day came. They went to court, and Cinderella followed them with her eyes as long as she could. When she lost sight of them, she started to cry. Her godmother, hey, we got the godmother here, okay, who saw her all in tears, asked her what was the matter. Now remember, the godmother is, in Catholic tradition, it is the person who is to take over the raising of the child if a parent dies, but she is also primarily the religious teacher of that child. She makes sure that she goes to her masses and her confessions, and on her first confession she buys her a pretty little dress and everything. So the godmother has a spiritual aspect in the Roman Church. But we're going to also combine this with some paganism, because the story is a fairy tale. The fairy godmother would be looked at as almost like a mother goddess back in the day. So it's a little combination of both paganism and Roman Catholicism mixed up together. I wish I could. She was not able to speak the rest, being interrupted by her tears and sobbing. This godmother of hers, who was a fairy, said to her, "You wish you could go to the ball, is it not so?" "Yes," cried Cinderella with a great sigh. "Well," said her godmother, "be but a good girl, and I will contrive that you shall go." Then she took her into her chamber and said to her, "Run into the garden and bring me a pumpkin." Cinderella went immediately to gather the finest she could get, and brought it to her godmother, not being able to imagine how this pumpkin could help her go to the ball. Her godmother scooped out all the inside of it, leaving nothing but the rind. Having done this, she struck the pumpkin with her wand, and it was instantly turned into a fine coach, gilded all over with gold. She then went to look into her mouse trap, where she found 6 mice all alive, and ordered Cinderella to lift up the little trap door. She gave each mouse, as it went out, a little tap with her wand, and the mouse was that moment turned into a fine horse, which altogether made a very fine set of 6 horses of a beautiful mouse-colored dapple gray. Being at a loss for a coachman, Cinderella said, "I will go and see if there's not a rat in the rat trap that we can turn into a coachman." She's getting in on the game here. "You are right," replied her godmother. "Go and look." Cinderella brought the trap to her, and in it there were 3 huge rats. The fairy chose the one that had the largest beard, and touched him with her wand, and turned him into a fat, jolly coachman, who had the smartest whiskers that eyes ever beheld. After that she said, "Go again into the garden. You will find 6 lizards behind the watering pot. Bring them to me." Now, she had no sooner done so, but her godmother turned them into 6 footmen, who skipped up immediately behind the coach with all their liveries, that's their uniform, and they would have been green and shiny looking like lizard skin, all bedaubed with gold and silver, and clung as close behind each other as if they had done nothing else their whole lives. They were a team. The fairy then said to Cinderella, "Well, you see here an equipage fit to go to the ball with. Are you not pleased with it?" "Oh, yes," she cried. "But must I go in these nasty rags?" It's like, "I'm very thankful for what you've done for me so far. That's all great. But do I have to go in this?" Her godmother then touched her with her wand, and at the same instant her clothes turned into cloth of gold and silver, all beset with jewels. This done, she gave her a pair of glass slippers, the prettiest in the whole world. Being thus decked out, she got up into her coach, but her godmother, above all things, commanded her not to stay past midnight, the witching hour, telling her at the same time that if she stayed 1 moment longer, the coach would be a pumpkin again, her horses mice, her coachman a rat, her footmen lizards, and that her clothes would become just as they were before. She promised her godmother to leave the ball before midnight, and they drove away, scarcely able to contain herself for joy. The king's son, who was told that a great princess, who nobody knew, had arrived, ran out to receive her. He gave her his hand, and she alighted from the coach and led her into the hall. Among all the company. There was immediately a profound silence. Everyone stopped dancing, and the violins ceased to play. So entranced was everyone with the singular beauties of the unknown newcomer. Then nothing was heard but a confused noise of, "How beautiful she is! How beautiful she is!" The king himself, old as he was, could not help watching her, and telling the queen softly it was a long time since he had seen so beautiful and lovely a creature. All the ladies were busied in considering her clothes and headdress, hoping to have some made the next day after the same pattern, provided they could find such fine materials and as able hands to make them. The king's son led her to the most honorable seat, and afterwards took her out to dance with him. She danced so very gracefully that they all the more and more admired her. A fine meal was served up, but the young prince ate not a morsel, so intently was he busied in gazing on her. She went and sat down by her sisters, showing them 1,000 civilities, giving them parts of the oranges and citrons which the prince had presented her with, which very much surprised them, for they did not know her. While Cinderella was thus amusing her sisters, she heard the clock strike 11 3/4, whereupon she immediately made curtsy to the company and hurried away as fast as she could. Arriving home, she ran to seek out her godmother, and after having thanked her, said she could not but heartily wish she might go to the ball the next day as well, because the king's son had invited her. As she was eagerly telling her godmother everything that had happened at the ball, her two sisters knocked at the door, which Cinderella ran and opened. "You stayed such a long time," she cried, gaping and rubbing her eyes and stretching herself as if she had been sleeping. She had not, however, any manner of inclination to sleep while they were away from home. "If you had been at the ball," said one of her sisters, "you would not have been tired with it. The finest princess was there, the most beautiful that mortal eyes have ever seen. She showed us 1,000 civilities," that means politenesses or niceties, "and gave us oranges and citrons." Cinderella seemed very indifferent in the matter. She asked them the name of the princess, but they told her they did not know it, and that the king's son was very uneasy on her account, and would give all the world to know who she was. At this, Cinderella, smiling, replied, "She must then be very beautiful indeed. How happy you have been! Could not I see her? Ah, dear Charlotte, do lend me your yellow dress which you wear every day." She's like, "Can I wear your everyday outfit to go and see?" "Yes, to be sure," cried Charlotte. "Lend my clothes to such a dirty cinder wench as you are. I should be a fool." So, yes, to be sure, is being sarcastic. Cinderella indeed well expected such an answer, and was very glad of the refusal, for she would have been sadly put to it if her sister had lent her what she had asked for jestingly. Cinderella was like, "Oh, can I wear your little, your yellow sweatpants, please? Can I?" And her sister's like, "No." And she's like, "Oh, phew. Okay." The next day, the two sisters were at the ball, and so was Cinderella, but dressed even more magnificently than before. The king's son was always by her, and never ceased his compliments and kind speeches to her. All this was so far from being tiresome to her, and indeed she quite forgot what her godmother had told her. She thought it was no later than 11 when she counted the clock striking 12. She jumped up and fled, nimble as a deer. The prince followed, but could not overtake her. She left behind one of her glass slippers, which the prince picked up most carefully. She reached home, quite out of breath, and in her nasty old clothes, having nothing left of all her finery but one of the little slippers, the mate to the one she had dropped. The guards at the palace gate were asked if they had not seen a princess go out. They replied they had seen nobody leave but a young girl very shabbily dressed, who had more the air of a poor country wench than a gentlewoman. When the two sisters returned from the ball, Cinderella asked them if they had been well entertained, and if the fine lady had been there. They told her yes, but she had hurried away immediately when it struck 12, and with so much haste that she dropped one of her little glass slippers, the prettiest in the world, which the king's son had picked up. That he had done nothing but look at her all the time at the ball, and that most certainly he was very much in love with the beautiful person who owned the glass slipper. What they said was very true, for a few days later the king's son had proclaimed, by sound of trumpet, that he would marry her whose foot this slipper would just fit. They began to try it on the princesses, then the duchesses, and all the court, but in vain. It was brought to the two sisters, who did all they possibly could to force their foot into the slipper, but they did not succeed. Cinderella, who saw all this and knew it was her slipper, said to them, laughing, "Let me see if it will not fit me." Her sisters burst out laughing and began to banter with her. The gentleman who was sent to try the slipper looked earnestly at Cinderella, and finding her very handsome, said it was only just that she should try as well, and that he had orders to let everyone try. He had Cinderella sit down, and putting the slipper to her foot, he found that it went on very easily, fitting her as if it had been made of wax. Her two sisters were greatly astonished, but then even more so, when Cinderella pulled out of her pocket the other slipper and put it on her other foot. Then in came her godmother and touched her wand to Cinderella's clothes, making them richer and more magnificent than any of those she had worn before. And now her two sisters found her to be that fine, beautiful lady whom they had seen at the ball. They threw themselves at her feet to beg pardon for all the ill treatment they had made her undergo. Cinderella took them up, and as she embraced them, said that she forgave them with all her heart, and wanted them always to love her. She was taken to the young prince, dressed as she was. He thought she was more charming than before, and a few days after married her. Cinderella, who was no less good than beautiful, gave her two sisters lodgings in the palace, and that very same day matched them with two great lords of the court. So in this one, there is no revenge for her ill treatment. Instead, her goodness shines through, even in the face of adversity, and she does her very best for her two sisters. Okay, guys, we are done with the Cinderella stories. I know some of you are very thankful, and some of you are like, "Aw." If you are one of the "aw" people, watch a version of Cinderella. Ever After is an excellent version. I believe I've mentioned it before. You can watch the Walt Disney version. I believe there's a live-action version as well. Go ahead, take some time, watch a movie. I hope you enjoyed these storytellings in this lecture. Do your homework a little bit of time so it doesn't get too in your face or hang over your head. That's what I'm trying to say. And I will talk to you again tomorrow. We'll do 2 more lectures tomorrow on literature so we can keep up with our world history. I'm sorry. Wow, let's try it again. With world literature. We'll be talking, I know, about Jack and the Beanstalk. So it's a guy's story. You guys are finally getting represented. All right. I will talk to you tomorrow. Have a really good night.